bustling Denver International Airport hummed with activity as passengers rushed to their gates. Among them were John and Mike, two young engineers in their late 20s, excitedly discussing their upcoming vacation in Bali. "I can't believe we're finally doing this," John said, adjusting his backpack. 2 weeks of sun, surf, and not a single line of code. Mike grinned, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. "After that nightmare project, we deserve it. Just a quick stop in LA, then we're off to paradise." As they approached their gate, they noticed a petite woman with short dark hair and striking green eyes sitting nearby, engrossed in a medical textbook. This was Dr. Alana Thompson, though John and Mike didn't know her name yet. The boarding call came, and the three found themselves filing onto the plane, along with 57 other passengers and 5 crew members. As John settled into his window seat, with Mike beside him, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of nervousness. "Relax," Mike said, noticing his friend's tension. "It's just a quick hop to LA." For the first hour, the flight was uneventful. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and promising a smooth flight to Los Angeles. However, as they flew over a dense wilderness area, the first signs of trouble appeared. The plane began to shake violently, causing panic among the passengers. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, his tone strained but professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain calm and fasten your seatbelts." The next few minutes were a blur of screams, creaking metal, and the sickening sensation of freefall. The last thing John remembered was the oxygen mask dropping in front of him before everything went black. When he came to, John found himself surrounded by twisted metal and the acrid smell of smoke. Dazed and disoriented, he stumbled to his feet, his ears ringing. As the fog in his mind cleared, the gravity of the situation hit him. They had crashed. Somewhere in the wilderness, far from civilization. As survivors began to stir and call out, John's eyes landed on a familiar face. Alana, her forehead bleeding but her gaze determined, was already moving among the wreckage, checking on other passengers. "Hey!" John called out, his voice hoarse. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Alana looked up, relief flooding her features at the sight of another able-bodied survivor. "I'm Dr. Thompson. Are you injured? Can you help me check for survivors?" John nodded, pushing aside his own fear and discomfort. As they worked, they discovered that 45 people had survived the initial crash, though many were in critical condition. It was then that John remembered Mike. Panic seized him as he frantically searched the wreckage. He found his friend pinned under a piece of the fuselage, conscious but in obvious pain. "Mike, thank God you're alive," John exclaimed, dropping to his knees beside his friend. Mike managed a weak smile. "Can't get rid of me that easily, but I think my leg's broken." As John worked to free Mike, he noticed a tall, muscular man with a shaved head helping other survivors. The man moved with purpose, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. This was Jake, though John didn't know it yet. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the dense forest, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were alive, but for how long? With limited supplies, no means of communication, and the threat of the wilderness looming around them, their ordeal was far from over. The surviving captain, his uniform torn and bloodied, approached John and Alana. "We've done a head count," he said, his voice grim. 45 survivors, including us. Many are in critical condition." John, Alana, and Jake exchanged looks. They knew that their fight for survival had only just begun. Before we go on with this story, tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and I'll send you a virtual hug in the next video. Make sure to follow, like, and subscribe for more intriguing stories. As the first rays of dawn broke through the dense canopy, John slowly regained consciousness. The events of the previous day came rushing back, and he bolted upright, his heart pounding. The wreckage of the plane surrounded him, a stark reminder of their dire situation. "Mike!" he called out, his voice hoarse. Relief washed over him as he heard a weak groan nearby. "Over here, John," Mike responded, his face contorted with pain. "My leg. It's not good." John scrambled to his friend's side, careful not to disturb the makeshift splint Dr. Thompson had applied the night before. "Hang in there, buddy. We're going to get you out of here." As John tended to Mike, he heard movement behind him. Dr. Alana Thompson approached, her medical bag clutched tightly in her hand. Despite the dirt and blood on her face, her green eyes were alert and focused. "How is he?" she asked, kneeling beside Mike. "The pain's getting worse," Mike admitted through gritted teeth. Alana nodded grimly. "I'll see what I can do to make you more comfortable, but our medical supplies are limited." As Alana worked on Mike, John stood up and surveyed their surroundings. The reality of their situation began to sink in. They were stranded in the middle of a vast wilderness with limited supplies and no way to call for help. "We need to take stock of our situation," a deep voice said behind him. John turned to see the muscular man he had noticed the day before. "Name's Jake," the man said, extending a calloused hand. "John," he replied, shaking Jake's hand. There was something about Jake that put John on edge, but he couldn't quite place it. Together, John and Jake began to search for other survivors. They found small groups huddled together, some injured, others in shock. The captain and the remaining crew members were doing their best to organize and calm the passengers. As the morning wore on, the full extent of their situation became clear. Out of the 65 people on board, 45 had survived the crash. However, many were in critical condition, and their chances of survival were dwindling by the hour. John's heart sank as he watched Alana move from one injured survivor to another, her face growing more worried with each patient. He approached her as she finished treating an elderly woman with a deep gash on her arm. "How bad is it?" he asked quietly. Alana sighed, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "It's not good, John. We have several people with internal injuries, broken bones, and severe lacerations. Without proper medical equipment and facilities..." She trailed off, the implication clear. John nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "What can we do?" "For now, we need to focus on finding clean water and food," Alana replied. "And we need to establish some kind of shelter. The nights are cold, and exposure could be just as deadly as their injuries." As they discussed their next steps, Jake approached, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. "We should also think about protection," he said, his voice low. "There's no telling what kind of predators are out there." John felt a chill run down his spine at Jake's words. He hadn't even considered the dangers that might be lurking in the forest. As the day progressed, the survivors began to organize themselves. Those who were able-bodied started gathering materials from the wreckage to build makeshift shelters. Others searched for any food and water that might have survived the crash. John found himself working alongside Jake, gathering firewood and constructing a basic lean-to. Despite his initial wariness, John had to admit that Jake's knowledge of the outdoors was proving invaluable. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, the survivors gathered around the small fires they had managed to build. The mood was somber as they shared what little food they had found. John sat between Mike and Alana, the weight of their situation heavy on his shoulders. As he looked around at the tired, scared faces of his fellow survivors, he realized that this was only the beginning of their ordeal. The real challenges lay ahead, and he wondered if they had the strength to face them. Little did they know, the wilderness held dangers beyond their imagination, and their fight for survival was just beginning. As the second day dawned, the reality of their situation began to sink in for all 45 survivors. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a grim determination to stay alive. John woke early, his body aching from sleeping on the hard ground. He glanced over at Mike, who was still asleep, his face etched with pain even in slumber. Nearby, Alana was already up, checking on the most critically injured survivors. The captain, a man in his 50s named Robert Hayes, called for everyone's attention. His uniform was torn and dirty, but his voice carried authority. "Listen up, everyone," he began, his tone grave but steady. We're in a dire situation, but if we work together, we can survive until rescue comes. First, we need to establish teams for essential tasks. He proceeded to divide the able-bodied survivors into groups, one for water collection, another for food gathering, a third for shelter improvement, and a fourth for maintaining a signal fire. Remember, he stressed, stay within shouting distance of the camp. We can't afford to lose anyone else. As the groups dispersed, John noticed a middle-aged woman named Sarah comforting a young boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. "It's okay, Tommy," Sarah soothed, her arm around the boy's shoulders. "We're going to be all right. The rescue teams will find us soon." John's heart ached at the sight. He approached them, kneeling down to the boy's level. "Hey there, Tommy. I'm John. How about you help me gather some berries for breakfast? I could use a brave assistant." Tommy nodded shyly, and Sarah mouthed a silent thank you to John as they walked away. Meanwhile, Jake had taken charge of the shelter improvement team. His knowledge of the forest proved invaluable as he showed the others how to weave branches and leaves to create more sturdy structures. "These will help keep us dry if it rains," he explained, demonstrating the technique. "And believe me, in this forest, it will rain." As the day progressed, the survivors worked tirelessly. Alana, assisted by a retired nurse named Margaret, tended to the injured. They used strips of clothing as bandages and boiled water to clean wounds. By mid-afternoon, 5 of the critically injured survivors had succumbed to their injuries despite Alana and Margaret's best efforts. The mood in the camp grew somber as they prepared to bury their fellow passengers. John, Jake, and several others dug graves in a clearing near the camp. As they worked, a young woman named Emily approached, tears streaming down her face. "One of them... She was my sister," Emily choked out. "We were going to LA for our cousin's wedding." John paused his digging, placing a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "I'm so sorry for your loss. We'll make sure she's laid to rest with dignity." As the sun began to set, the survivors gathered for the impromptu funeral. The captain said a few words, his voice thick with emotion. "We've lost 5 of our own today. Let their memory give us strength to carry on, to fight for survival, so that their deaths will not be in vain." After the burial, the crew distributed the meager rations they had managed to salvage from the plane. As night fell, the survivors huddled around small fires, the gravity of their situation weighing heavily on them all. John sat with Alana, both of them exhausted from the day's events. "How are we doing on medical supplies?" he asked quietly. Alana shook her head, her expression grim. "We're running low. If we don't get rescued soon..." Her words were cut off by a rustling in the nearby bushes. Jake, who had been keeping watch, immediately tensed up, grabbing a makeshift spear. "Everyone, stay quiet," he hissed, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The rustling grew louder, and then a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the shadows. The survivors held their breath, fear gripping their hearts as they faced yet another threat in their fight for survival. As the night wore on, the reality of their situation became clear. They were not just battling against time and their injuries, but against the very wilderness that surrounded them. Their ordeal was far from over, and the coming days would test them in ways they could never have imagined. Day 2 dawned with ominous gray clouds looming overhead. The air felt thick and heavy, promising rain. John woke to the sound of distant thunder, a sense of dread settling in his stomach. Captain Hayes gathered the survivors, his face etched with concern. "We need to prepare for a storm," he announced. "Everyone, secure what supplies we have and reinforce the shelters." As the survivors scrambled to follow the captain's orders, Alana approached John. "We need to move the injured to higher ground," she said urgently. "If it floods, they'll be in danger." John nodded, immediately setting to work. He and Jake, along with several others, carefully relocated the injured to a slightly elevated area, using debris from the plane to create makeshift stretchers. The first drops of rain began to fall as they finished moving the last patient. Within minutes, it had turned into a deluge. The survivors huddled under the reinforced shelters, watching as water began to pool around the crash site. "Look!" Tommy, the young boy John had befriended, pointed to the sky. Through a brief break in the clouds, they saw a helicopter in the distance. Hope surged through the group, only to be quickly dashed as the dense canopy and heavy rain obscured them from view. The helicopter moved on, its sound fading into the distance. "They didn't see us," Emily said, her voice breaking with disappointment. Jake put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They're looking for us. That's what matters. We just need to hang on." As the day wore on, the storm intensified. Wind howled through the trees, threatening to tear apart their makeshift shelters. John and Jake worked tirelessly to keep the structures intact, using their bodies to shield the more vulnerable survivors from the worst of the elements. Alana moved from patient to patient, doing her best to keep them dry and comfortable. But the harsh conditions were taking their toll. 2 more of the critically injured succumbed to their wounds, unable to withstand the added stress of the storm. As night fell, a new threat emerged. The howling of wolves echoed through the forest, sending chills down the spines of the survivors. "They're probably just as scared of the storm as we are," Jake reassured the group, but his hand tightened on his makeshift spear. John noticed Tommy trembling with fear. He sat down next to the boy, putting an arm around his shoulders. "Hey, remember how brave you were helping me gather berries? We need that bravery now. Can you help me keep watch?" Tommy nodded, his fear giving way to a look of determination. As the night wore on, the storm began to subside. The survivors emerged from their shelters, surveying the damage. The crash site was a mess of mud and debris, but miraculously, most of their supplies had survived. It was then that Jake made a startling discovery. "Hey everyone, look at this!" The group gathered around him. There, in the mud, was a clear footprint, but not one made by any of the survivors. "Is that human?" John asked, his heart racing. Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the tree line. "And it's fresh, made after the rain stopped." A mix of hope and apprehension swept through the group. Could there be others nearby, potential rescuers? Or was this a new threat they'd have to face? As the sun began to rise on their 3rd day in the wilderness, the survivors were left with a new mystery to unravel. The footprint offered a glimmer of hope, but it also served as a reminder that they were not alone in this vast, unforgiving forest. John exchanged looks with Alana and Jake. They knew that the coming days would bring new challenges, but also potentially new opportunities for rescue. As the group began to clean up after the storm, they steeled themselves for whatever lay ahead, their will to survive stronger than ever. Day 3 broke with a somber mood hanging over the survivors' camp. The toll of their ordeal was becoming increasingly apparent, both physically and emotionally. John woke early, his muscles aching from the previous day's exertions. He found Alana already up, tending to the injured. Her face was drawn with exhaustion and worry. "How are they doing?" John asked softly. Alana shook her head, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "We lost 3 more during the night. The elderly couple and one of the children. I couldn't do anything to save them." John placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, feeling the weight of their losses. The group was now down to 27 survivors. As the morning progressed, the captain called a meeting. "We need to address our dwindling supplies," he began, his voice grave. "And we need to consider the possibility of moving our camp. Following that river we found might lead us to civilization." Debate broke out among the survivors. Some argued for staying put, hoping rescue would come soon. Others, including Jake, pushed for movement. "We can't just sit here waiting to die," Jake argued, his eyes flashing. "That footprint we found, it could mean there's a village nearby." As the discussion heated up, a sound cut through the air, the distant whoomp-whoomp of helicopter blades. Everyone froze, then scrambled to the clearest area they could find, waving and shouting desperately. But just like before, the dense canopy obscured them from view. The helicopter passed overhead without seeing them, its sound fading into the distance. The disappointment was palpable. Emily broke down in tears, and others weren't far behind. It was Jake who finally broke the silence. "This settles it," he said firmly. "We need to move. Follow the river. Find higher ground. Somewhere we can be seen." With heavy hearts but renewed determination, the survivors began to pack up what little they had. John helped Mike to his feet, supporting his friend's weight. "You okay to travel, buddy?" John asked, concerned. Mike nodded grimly. "Don't have much choice, do I? But yeah, I'll manage." As they set out following the course of the river, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He mentioned it to Jake, who nodded in agreement. "I've had the same feeling," Jake admitted. "Keep your eyes open. Could be animals, or something else." They traveled for several hours, the going slow due to the injured and the difficult terrain. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion was setting in. That's when they heard it, voices speaking in a language none of them recognized. Jake held up a hand, signaling everyone to stop and stay quiet. Cautiously, he and John crept forward, peering through the undergrowth. What they saw made their hearts race. A small group of men, dressed in simple clothing and carrying spears and bows, were walking along the riverbank. They were clearly not part of any rescue team. "Indigenous hunters," Jake whispered. "This could be our chance." Before John could stop him, Jake stepped out into the open, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. The hunters immediately raised their weapons, shouting in their unfamiliar language. Jake spoke slowly, using gestures to convey their situation. To John's amazement, the hunters' stance relaxed slightly. One of them, seemingly the leader, nodded and gestured for them to follow. "What do we do?" John asked, torn between hope and caution. Jake turned to the group. "We follow them. It's our best chance." With no better options, the survivors cautiously emerged from hiding. The hunters, though wary, didn't seem hostile. They led the group to a small clearing where a fire was burning. To everyone's surprise and relief, the hunters shared their food, roasted game and forest fruits. It wasn't much, but to the starving survivors, it was a feast. As night fell, the survivors found themselves in an unfamiliar but not unwelcoming camp. The language barrier was frustrating, but the hunters' actions spoke of compassion and a willingness to help. John sat with Alana and Mike, watching as Jake attempted to communicate with the hunters' leader through gestures and drawings in the dirt. "What do you think will happen now?" Alana asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John shook his head. "I don't know, but for the first time since the crash, I feel like we might actually have a chance." As they settled in for the night, the mood among the survivors was cautiously optimistic. They had found help, unexpected as it was. But what tomorrow would bring, none of them could guess. The journey was far from over, but at least now, they weren't facing it alone. As the fourth day dawned, the survivors found themselves in the indigenous people's village, a collection of simple but sturdy huts in a large clearing. The change of scenery brought a renewed sense of hope to the group, though communication remained a significant challenge. John woke early, his body still aching but his spirit lifted by their new circumstances. He found Alana already at work, collaborating with the village healer to treat the injured survivors. Despite the language barrier, they seemed to have developed a system of gestures and nods to communicate. "How's it going?" John asked, approaching Alana. She looked up, a small smile on her face. "Better than I expected. Their knowledge of medicinal plants is incredible. Look at Mike's leg." John glanced over to where Mike was resting. The swelling in his injured leg had noticeably decreased, and Mike's face showed less pain than it had in days. "They're using some kind of poultice," Alana explained. "I can't identify all the ingredients, but the results are promising." As the morning progressed, the survivors began to settle into a routine. Those who were able-bodied helped with various tasks around the village, eager to repay their host's kindness. Jake, with his outdoors experience, seemed to be fitting in particularly well, joining the hunters on their excursions. Around midday, A commotion at the edge of the village caught everyone's attention. Jake had returned from a hunting trip, but instead of game, he carried news that sent a ripple of excitement through the group. "I saw another helicopter," he announced, his eyes wide with urgency. "It was circling an area about half a day's walk from here. They're still looking for us." The revelation energized the survivors. Suddenly, rescue seemed tantalizingly close. However, the captain urged caution. "We can't all go," he said, his voice firm. "Many of us are still too weak to make the journey. We need to send a small group, our strongest and fittest." After much discussion, it was decided that Jake, John, and 2 of the indigenous hunters would make the trek to try and signal the rescue teams. Alana would stay behind to continue caring for the injured. As John prepared for the journey, he found Alana packing a small bag of medical supplies for him. "Be careful out there," she said, her green eyes filled with concern. "And John, come back safe." John nodded, suddenly aware of the bond that had formed between them over the past few days. "I will. Take care of everyone here." The small group set out just as the sun reached its zenith. The going was tough, with dense undergrowth and steep inclines, but the thought of rescue spurred them on. Jake led the way, his experience in the wilderness proving invaluable. As they neared the area where Jake had spotted the helicopter, the group began to hear a faint but unmistakable sound, the whirring of rotor blades. They quickened their pace, hearts pounding with anticipation. Breaking through the tree line into a small clearing, they finally saw it, a search and rescue helicopter hovering low over the canopy. John and Jake began waving frantically, shouting at the top of their lungs. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the helicopter might pass them by. But then, miraculously, it began to descend. The rush of wind from the rotors whipped around them as the craft touched down in the clearing. As the rescue team emerged from the helicopter, John felt a wave of emotion wash over him. They had done it. They were saved. The next few hours passed in a blur. John explained the situation to the rescue team, who immediately radioed for additional support. As they waited for more helicopters to arrive, John couldn't help but think of the others back in the village, Alana, Mike, and all the survivors who had endured so much. As the sun began to set, a fleet of helicopters descended on the indigenous village. The survivors, some crying with relief, others laughing with joy, were carefully loaded onto the aircraft. John made sure to thank their indigenous hosts, wishing there was some way to truly express their gratitude for the life-saving help they had provided. Finally, as the last of the helicopters lifted off, John found himself seated next to Alana. As they watched the forest recede below them, he reached out and took her hand. "We made it," he said softly. Alana squeezed his hand in return, her eyes shining with tears of relief. "Yes, we did." As they flew towards civilization and the promise of safety, John knew that while their ordeal in the wilderness was over, the impact of those harrowing days would stay with them forever. They had faced death, formed unbreakable bonds, and discovered strengths they never knew they had. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The helicopters touched down at a bustling hospital in the nearest major city. As soon as the rotors stopped spinning, the area erupted into a flurry of activity. Medical staff rushed forward with stretchers and wheelchairs, quickly triaging and transporting the survivors. John stumbled out of the helicopter, his legs wobbly after days in the wilderness. The bright lights and noise of civilization felt overwhelming after the quiet of the forest. He blinked, trying to adjust, as a paramedic approached him. "Sir, are you injured? Can you follow me, please?" the paramedic asked, gently guiding John towards the emergency entrance. John nodded, still dazed. "I'm okay, I think. But my friend Mike, his leg—" "Don't worry, sir. We're taking care of everyone," the paramedic assured him. As John was led into the hospital, he caught glimpses of his fellow survivors being whisked away to various departments. He saw Alana being pulled aside by a group of doctors, no doubt sharing her expertise on the conditions of the injured. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical examinations, questions from authorities, and a much-needed shower and change of clothes. When John finally had a moment to himself, he found himself in a quiet corner of the bustling emergency department. That's when he noticed the commotion near the hospital entrance. A crowd of reporters had gathered, their cameras flashing as they tried to catch a glimpse of the survivors. Family members of the passengers were also there, anxiously scanning faces and calling out names. John's heart ached as he watched tearful reunions and heard cries of both joy and anguish. He thought of his own family, realizing with a start that they must have been worried sick. A nurse approached him, holding out a phone. "Mr. Matthews, your parents are on the line." With trembling hands, John took the phone. "Mom, Dad," his voice cracked as he heard their relieved sobs on the other end. As he reassured his parents that he was safe, John's eyes scanned the room. He saw Mike being wheeled past, his leg now properly set and casted. Their eyes met, and Mike gave him a weak thumbs up. After ending the call with his parents, John found himself at a loss. The adrenaline that had kept him going for days was fading, leaving him feeling drained and disoriented. It was then that he spotted Alana across the room, looking equally lost. He made his way over to her, navigating through the sea of medical staff and patients. "Hey," he said softly. Alana looked up, relief flooding her features. "John, I'm glad you're okay." "Thanks to you," he replied. "You kept us all going out there." Alana shook her head. "We all did our part. I can't believe it's over." John nodded, understanding the mix of relief and disbelief she was feeling. On impulse, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a scrap of paper, a corner torn from a hospital form. He scribbled his phone number on it. "Here," he said, handing it to Alana. "I know we're all going to be busy with debriefings and recovery and everything, but I'd like to stay in touch. If you want to, that is." Alana took the paper, a small smile playing on her lips. "I'd like that." Their moment was interrupted by a commotion near the entrance. Jake was there, surrounded by reporters, looking uncomfortable with the attention. "I should go help him," John said, gesturing towards Jake. "He's not used to all this." Alana nodded. "Go. I'll find you later." As John made his way towards Jake, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief at being rescued, grief for those they had lost, uncertainty about the future, and a newfound appreciation for life. He knew that the events of the past few days would stay with him forever. The chapter of survival in the wilderness had closed, but a new one was just beginning. As John reached Jake and began to shield him from the barrage of questions, he realized that their journey was far from over. The bonds forged in the face of adversity would not easily be broken, and the lessons learned would shape the rest of their lives. A week had passed since the rescue, and John found himself sitting in a quiet hospital room, watching Mike as he slept. His friend's leg was elevated, encased in a cast covered with signatures from nurses and fellow survivors. The steady beep of the heart monitor was a constant reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. John's mind wandered to their original plans. By now, they should have been lounging on a beach in Bali, sipping cocktails and watching the sunset. Instead, they were here, recovering from an ordeal that had changed them forever. Mike stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Hey," he said groggily, recognizing John. "Hey yourself," John replied, leaning forward. "How are you feeling?" Mike attempted a smile, wincing slightly. "Like I got into a fight with a mountain and lost, but I'm alive, so I guess I can't complain too much." There was a moment of silence between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts and emotions. Finally, John spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We should be in Bali right now." Mike let out a mirthless chuckle. "Yeah, we should. White sand beaches, crystal clear water. Instead, we got a crash course in wilderness survival," John finished. They both fell silent again, the weight of their experience hanging in the air. "You know," Mike said after a while, "I keep thinking about how excited we were for this vacation, how we thought it was going to be the adventure of a lifetime." John nodded, understanding where Mike was going. And it turned out to be an adventure all right, just not the one we planned. I feel, I don't know, guilty almost, Mike confessed. Here we are, disappointed about missing a vacation, when others... He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. John reached out, placing a hand on Mike's arm. I know, I feel it too. But we're allowed to feel disappointed, Mike. It doesn't diminish what we went through or what others lost. Mike nodded, blinking back tears. I just keep thinking about how lucky we are. To be alive, to be here. We are, John agreed. And I think the best way to honor that luck, to honor those we lost, is to live. Really live, you know? A small smile tugged at Mike's lips. Yeah, I know. And hey, maybe we'll get that beach vacation someday. Just... maybe not Bali. John chuckled, feeling some of the tension ease. Deal. How about a nice landlocked destination next time? They both laughed, the sound a bit rusty from disuse but genuine. As their laughter faded, a comfortable silence settled between them. John leaned back in his chair, watching the late afternoon sun filter through the hospital window. He thought about Alana, wondering how she was coping. He thought about Jake, hoping the man had found some peace away from the media frenzy. He thought about all the survivors, bound together by an experience that no one else could truly understand. We're going to be okay, aren't we? Mike asked, his voice small but hopeful. John turned back to his friend, a determined look in his eyes. Yeah, Mike, we are. It might take time and it won't be easy, but we're going to be okay. As they sat there, two friends forever changed by circumstance, John felt a mix of gratitude and resolve wash over him. They had survived against all odds, and now they had the chance to live life to its fullest. It wasn't the adventure they had planned, but it was the one they had been given, and they were determined to make the most of it. Several weeks had passed since the rescue, and life was slowly returning to a semblance of normalcy for the survivors. John had been discharged from the hospital and was staying in a nearby town, unable to bring himself to leave just yet. The bond he shared with his fellow survivors was too strong, too fresh to simply walk away from. One crisp morning, John found himself wandering the streets of the small town, his mind still processing the events of the past month. As he turned a corner, he nearly collided with someone. "Oh, I'm sorry," he began, then stopped short. "Alana?" There she was, Dr. Alana Thompson, looking as surprised as he felt. She was dressed in casual clothes, a far cry from the disheveled appearance they'd all sported in the wilderness or the professional attire of the hospital. "John," she said, a smile spreading across her face. "I didn't expect to run into you here." "Likewise," he replied, suddenly aware of how fast his heart was beating. "Are you staying in town?" Alana nodded. "For a little while, yes. I'm helping with some of the follow-up care for our fellow survivors. What about you?" "I'm not really sure," John admitted. "I just couldn't leave yet, you know?" Understanding flashed in Alana's eyes. "I know exactly what you mean." They stood there for a moment, the busy street fading into the background. Then John cleared his throat. "Would you like to grab a coffee? Catch up properly?" Alana's smile widened. "I'd love to." They found a small cafe nearby, settling into a quiet corner booth. As they sipped their coffees, the conversation flowed easily, touching on their recovery, their fellow survivors, and the challenges of readjusting to normal life. "It's strange," Alana said, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "In the hospital, I'm Dr. Thompson, professional and composed, but then I come back to my hotel room and I don't know who I am anymore." John nodded, understanding completely. "It's like we left part of ourselves in that forest, the people we were before the crash. They don't exist anymore." "Exactly," Alana agreed. "But at the same time, I feel like I discovered a strength I never knew I had." "You were amazing out there," John said softly. "We wouldn't have made it without you." Alana blushed slightly, looking down at her coffee. We all did what we had to do. You were pretty incredible yourself, you know." As they continued to talk, John felt a warmth growing in his chest. Here was someone who understood, who had been through the same harrowing experience. Someone who had seen him at his worst and his best. Their coffee date stretched into lunch, and then a walk in a nearby park. They talked about their lives before the crash, their hopes for the future, and everything in between. With each passing hour, John felt himself drawn more and more to Alana. As the sun began to set, they found themselves back where they had started, reluctant to part ways. "I'm glad I ran into you today," John said, his voice soft. Alana smiled, her green eyes twinkling in the fading light. "So am I. It's been nice, really nice." On impulse, John reached out and took her hand. "Maybe we could do this again? Tomorrow?" Alana's fingers intertwined with his, sending a thrill through John's body. "I'd like that," she replied. As they said their goodbyes, promising to meet the next day, John felt a sense of hope that he hadn't experienced since before the crash. Life had thrown them an unimaginable curveball, but perhaps, just perhaps, something beautiful could come from it. Walking back to his hotel, John realized that while the crash had taken so much from them, it had also given them something precious. A connection forged in the fires of adversity, an understanding that went beyond words. And as he thought about seeing Alana again tomorrow, he felt, for the first time in weeks, truly excited about the future. 1 year later. The sun shone brightly over a picturesque garden where rows of white chairs were arranged facing an floral arch. The air buzzed with excitement and the murmur of guests finding their seats. This was no ordinary wedding. It was the union of John Matthews and Alana Thompson, survivors of a crash that had captured the nation's attention a year ago. John stood at the altar, his palms sweaty but his heart full. Mike, his best man, gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You ready for this, buddy?" he asked with a grin. John nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw familiar faces, fellow survivors who had become like family. Jake sat in the front row, looking uncomfortable in a suit but beaming with pride. The captain of their ill-fated flight was there too, along with several crew members who had made it through the ordeal. Suddenly, the music changed, and everyone rose to their feet. John's breath caught in his throat as Alana appeared at the end of the aisle, radiant in her white gown. As she walked towards him, their eyes locked, and the world seemed to fade away. In that moment, all the pain, fear, and struggle of the past year melted away, leaving only love and hope for the future. The ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity, with vows that spoke of resilience, support, and a love forged in the face of adversity. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience as John and Alana sealed their union with a kiss. As the newlyweds made their way back down the aisle, confetti raining down on them, they were met with a surprise. A television crew was waiting, cameras rolling to capture this moment for a special broadcast. Their story of survival and love had captivated the public, and sponsors had come forward to help create this dream wedding. The reception was a joyous affair, filled with laughter, tears, and shared memories. During the toasts, Mike stood up, his glass raised high. "To John and Alana," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "who proved that even in our darkest moments, love can bloom. You guys give us all hope." Jake was next, his usual gruff demeanor softened by the occasion. "I've seen a lot in my life," he said, "but I've never seen two people more meant for each other. You both have a strength that amazes me." As the night wore on, John and Alana found a quiet moment alone. They stood on a balcony overlooking the twinkling lights of the city, hand in hand. "Can you believe we're here?" Alana asked, leaning her head on John's shoulder. "A year ago, we were fighting for our lives in that forest." John squeezed her hand. "And now we're starting a new life together. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm almost grateful for that crash. Without it, I might never have met you." Alana lifted her head, meeting his gaze. "I know what you mean. It's strange to find blessing in tragedy, but here we are, They shared a tender kiss, the sounds of the reception fading into the background. As they broke apart, John noticed a shooting star streaking across the sky. "Make a wish," he whispered. Alana smiled, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "I don't need to. Everything I could wish for is right here." As they rejoined their guests, John and Alana knew that while their journey had begun in fear and desperation, it had led them to love and hope. Their story, broadcast to millions, served as a reminder that even in the darkest times, light can be found. And as they danced under the stars, surrounded by those who had shared in their incredible journey, they looked forward to writing the next chapters of their lives together. The celebration of John and Alana's union wasn't just a wedding. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the bonds forged in adversity, and the power of love to heal and transform. As the night drew to a close, the newlyweds and their guests left with full hearts, each carrying a piece of this miraculous story with them. And so, a tale that began with a tragic crash ended with a joyous new beginning, reminding us all that even in our darkest moments, hope and love can guide us to a brighter future.